Hi, Josh.
Hi there, Brink. How are you today?
I'm good. For our viewers, I'm Brink Lindsey of the Cato Institute.
Josh Cohen of Stanford University and Boston Review.
So just a little bit ago, Barack Obama signed into law the landmark healthcare legislation. I guess that's something we could talk about, isn't it?
Yeah, we probably could take a few minutes on that. We've talked about it a little bit before. I think we have probably both, are kind of fixed in our ways on this. But let's say a few things about that.
I thought this type of healthcare reform was fundamentally ill-conceived, and so I don't see this as a great step forward. I support the principle that all people should have access to some decent minimum of health care without regard to ability to pay. And so I think on the plus side of the ledger of this legislation is the fact that up to 30 million Americans are going to have access to reliable access to health care rather than just going to an emergency room, and that's a plus. Some of the crazier, more dysfunctional elements of our current system, like the fact that people lose their health care when they lose their jobs, and if in the meantime they've developed some illness, they're not going to get insured again. The fact that insurance companies knock people off their rolls once they get sick, things like that are supposedly going to be no more, and I think that's a good thing because those were terrible dysfunctions.
Those are big good things, not just little good things.
Right. Yeah, agreed. All that said, I think the whole system of employer-provided health insurance in name, if not actual insurance, more like prepaid medical care, is a bad idea, and we've gotten to where we are through this weird path-dependent process, starting with World War II wage and price controls, and ended up with this system of this Rube Goldberg device of mandates and subsidies, and many of the subsidies going to all the wrong people, and many of the mandates causing all kinds of unintended consequences, which then cause the need for other subsidies and mandates. And now we've just piled a heap of new mandates and subsidies on top of the edifice, and I think that's a bad idea. Just to not go over all this old ground, I'll refer to what I think is one of the best articles or one of the best pieces written on what's wrong with our basic architecture of healthcare financing. It was a piece done in the Atlantic Monthly by David Goldhill called How American Healthcare Killed My Father. He also recently, last week, did a Huffington Post article about why he, as a good Democrat, couldn't support this reform legislation, and it tracks my views generally. We'll put up links to those.
I didn't read the most recent one. It was he was concerned about its excessively Rube, to use your term, Rube Goldberg-y quality. That you were taking something that was a bad idea to begin with, and then trying to add a bunch of epicycles to it and just making it worse. Is that
and let me back up and concede that I understand the compelling political logic for doing so. Just as progressives have had to wrap their mind around the fact that there was just no way that a single-payer healthcare system was going to get enacted in this country under present political circumstances. I will admit that the kind of healthcare system that I would like to see, which would be either single-payer, catastrophic sort of basic, stripped-down health insurance with private markets adding on top of that, or a purely private health insurance system, which would basically be catastrophic care with subsidies for the poor and sick who can't afford it. Right. Either way, that's what I would like to see. I don't see any prospect for that being enacted under current political circumstances. There's
just
zero
let me
appetite.
ask you. You say a health insurance market with subsidies for access, and also with a requirement on buy-in. Is that your?
A requirement on what?
A requirement on buy-in. You have to have coverage.
I don't.
I know you don't like that, but I mean,
yeah.
do you think that's an important part of making it functional, as in the Massachusetts system, and now in the newly signed legislation?
Yeah, I think we could have a system where everybody who wanted health insurance could get it without having the mandate. I don't think the mandate adds a lot to the kind of system I have in mind. But let's put that aside, because my point is the kind of system that I would like to see just isn't in the cards right now. And so really the only way to expand or to get to universal health care was building upon the contraption we have now. And so I understand why that choice was made. I think the correct approach was to fix our system and then expand access to it rather than the order taken. But there we are. It has happened. Progressives are understandably excited, even delirious, euphoric, triumphant, and sometimes that's humorous because they're delirious about a bill that a year ago or more they would have thought was a contemptible compromise piece of junk. But winning's sweet, even with compromises. And Republicans are proclaiming the end of America and all other kinds of hysterics. And I suspect neither side's right.
No, there's a lot of childishness. There was a bunch of childishness up front on the progressive side. I completely agree with you that you've had people issuing. I'm not going to name any names, but if you follow the debate about this, you'll know the references. People issuing large and enthusiastic congratulations for what's been done, who've been fighting the legislation on the progressive side all along and doing something that I think is, the chief, or one of the chief, there's competition here, but one of the chief deficiencies of contemporary American politics, maybe it goes deeper in the American grain than that, which is turning elevating every policy disagreement into a disagreement of fundamental principle. And I think that's been true all along on the public option issue, where you have people who said, I want single payer, which is, as you have said before here, it's my view, but then said if I can't get single payer, what I want is a big public option, and if I can't get a big public option, I want a little public option. If you don't have any public option, then you might as well not have anything at all. You've given up on the fundamental principle, and I think that is. There were people who took a strong line against that, and Paul Krugman on the progressive side in particular did, and I think he was absolutely right about that. There was absolutely no basis for treating the presence of a public option that would have covered a couple of million people as a fundamental issue of principle here. So there's been a lot of childishness, political immaturity, regrettable, very unfortunate political immaturity on the progressive side up front. And now, as you say, it's being matched by a comparable, or arguably more than comparable, craziness among the opponents of the bill.
And let me just take up a couple of the kind of procedural objections that are being made now, and that have at least some political traction, and that I don't really buy. There's the argument that it is noteworthy that a major piece of social legislation was passed on a straight line party vote, with public opinion polls showing a majority opposed to the legislation. So that is absolutely noteworthy, and the Dems have definitely gone way out on a limb, and they may pay a stiff political price down the road, or who knows? But they may. If the election were held next week, they would. But the idea that having done this is some kind of assault on democracy, I think is baloney. We have a representative democracy. These guys won their election. They did what they wanted to do and what they thought was the right thing to do while they were still in power, and they will face political accountability for it. I don't see any any violation of democratic principle there at all. Certainly no violation of any kind of original vision for how our polity would work, since we didn't have reliable public opinion polls until just a few decades ago. So no one would have had any idea what the exact public temperature was on this legislation at any given time.
I just want to... I completely, you won't be surprised, I completely agree with you on that. I think there is something a little bit comical about some of the, these kind of plebiscitarian arguments for, making legislation on the basis of the latest public, opinion poll, or the magnitude of the voices that are sitting outside Congress, by people who were, quite properly defending the legitimacy of the Bush administration's doing what it was doing when its polling numbers were Nixonian. So there's something a little silly about that, and I think it's the comparable to arguing every time you don't like what's happening in Congress, you argue that the Senate is unconstitutional because it's not based on a one person one vote principle. It's an arguable case, but you don't strengthen the argument by making it when you're losing a vote, because then what you're doing is treating all aspects of our of the political institutions of the country as just objects of manipulation to win the latest vote. So, but I also agree with you that it's an a very unhappy situation when a piece of legislation of this magnitude is passed by gets through the House by by a couple of votes. There were I've looked back a few times at both at the debates about and the votes on Medicare, and there were a couple of things that were notably different. This is in alternative. So one of the things that was notably different was that there actually was an alternative proposal that was on the table. The Republicans had a proposal, alternative to Medicare. So there you could have a debate about which of these was the best way of getting seniors covered. This was not like, we have a lot of good ideas and, let's start the process all over again and we'll tell you what our good ideas are and you're not taking it up. There was none of that kind of... They had a proposal. And there also was a bipartisan vote in support of Medicare. There wasn't a situation where there was nobody on the Republican side who was going to come on board. So I agree. It's not a constitutional issue, but it is a political issue, and I think we're at the beginning, really. Maybe not the beginning. We're midway through the political process on this. I do think it's, the 2010 election and maybe 2012 as well are going to be treated as referenda on this approach to health care. And, I think that it's a very much an arguable case at this point, who that's going to work in favor of. We will see. It's just as a parenthetical. It's how amazing is it how fast the mood here in Washington changes. I think if you really lived in the mentality of the news cycle, you would just be stark raving insane. You would be so bipolar. You just couldn't function because it was just 6 weeks ago that Scott Brown won his big upset win,
and Dems were tearing their hair out, and conservatives were crowing, and it looked like Obama was finished and healthcare was dead, and now here he is with this landmark signing ceremony, a historical presidency, transformative, up there with Truman and LBJ. And,
no, I think it took. I think it took roughly from last year, about a year ago. It took, I'd say, probably from about March 1st until about, I don't know, I'm just making these dates up, but you get the idea. I mean, from March 1st until about April 7th, for the Republicans to have gone from a position of completely abject defeat. It was the yet another either celebration or whatever of the demise of the Republican Party to, the Republicans have a bright future and Obama better watch out. I'm as guilty of this as the next person. Watching what's going on in the blogosphere a little too much, but it's ridiculous, and it is one of the most awful pathologies of American politics. Current American politics. I have to say that one person who seems relatively immune from this is Obama.
I agree.
He's
cool.
This is a patient guy. Yeah, he's cool. Right. He's a very patient guy.
But it's for those of us who live in Washington and or just follow politics on a day-to-day basis. It really is. You just have to keep telling yourself to that. Whatever it feels like right now is an overreaction, because it's going to change a few weeks from now. The other procedural objection that people are making, and that's getting a lot of attention and got a lot of attention in the run-up to the vote, is all the squalid side deals and arm twisting that went into getting this thing passed. But I won't defend any of it. It is all squalid and sordid, but I don't see anything particularly different about this bill than a whole bunch of other bills passed by the other side. It's the way the sausage gets ground, and it's ugly business. But I don't see anything especially exceptional about this. And in fact, I think it's noteworthy. It's a commentary on the deeply trivial nature of the Republican Party these days, that pretty much all of the attention has been focused either on these just kind of broad kind of caricature claims of socialism and so forth, or on these procedural shenanigans, the Louisiana Purchase, the Cornhusker kickback,
and just the Gatorade,
and then but precious little talk about the things you might expect Republicans to talk about that they didn't like in this bill, like the mandate, just hammering home to people that you're going to be forced to buy something even if you don't want to, or all the various tax increases that are going to go online to help pay for this thing. Just none of that really ever showed up in the debate.
And why is that, Brink? Why is that? I mean, so let's take the case of the mandate. I mean, so there is a mandate in the Massachusetts legislation, but it's not like Mitt Romney is in is in Congress and telling people, mum's the word on that.
Right. No.
Why didn't somebody make it their campaign to say this bill is a disaster because it has a mandate? It is one of the legal arguments against the bill. I don't think it's a legal argument that'll stick, but what do I know? It was.
No, I feel that the Republicans have just, at least temporarily, lost the capacity to be serious about public policy. So if a public policy issue is front and center, then their approaches are kind of the broadest, most vulgar kind of ideological arguments, or procedural nitpicking of finding little mini scandals that'll play well on the cable news cycle. But the boring meat and potatoes of how the bill works and what it will do and how it will work over in the out years, that's just they just can't be bothered with it.
Can't be bothered. So we communicated online a little bit about this piece by David Frum that was online yesterday and got so much attention that the comment
Yes.
function was shut down, and has not drawn enthusiastic reaction from some of the
No.
House Republicans.
So he basically argued that if Republicans had played ball and negotiated rather than taking this kill the bill strategy approach, that they could have produced a better bill.
Right, but there were a few other things that he said though, and I thought the thing that was most interesting and important was he characterized the legislation. I mean, as flawed in various ways. He's didn't like every detail in it, but basically what he said is this is Heritage Foundation 1993.
Yes,
that's the core of the legislation because it has no public. Not only is it not single payer, it doesn't have a public option. It is essentially a kind of market creation with subsidies to get people into the markets. I mean, it's something like the kind of things that you were saying before. I don't mean, at a fine grain, because it builds on existing stuff in a way that you don't like. But the basic, I think what David Frum had in mind is that this is essentially, you create some big insurance pools for people to buy into. That's a kind of market creation. And then you provide subsidies for people who can't get into those markets. So this is essentially the core of what the Heritage Foundation was proposing in 1993 as an alternative to the Clinton health plan. David,
I think it is. Yeah, I think it's completely fair to say that this legislation bears as much resemblance to the Heritage Plan of yore as any real life piece of legislation bears resemblance to the policy wonkery that got the ball rolling. But absolutely, it's true.
Yeah. Now, that's, of course, David Frum is not running for office. That's an unutterable sentence for any elected Republican official.
Yep.
There's nothing like it that's been said by anybody. So,
and of course, it's even closer, to Romney care in Massachusetts, and he can't say that.
Well, right, he can't say that because, and what Romney's response on that is, because of course he's been pressed on this. Well, pressed on it is, he's been asked about it, and his statement is that that's Massachusetts and not the country.
Right.
There is absolutely there's a difference between doing things at the state level and doing things nationally, but the idea that, for example, it's okay for a state to mandate purchase, but it's not okay for the national government to mandate purchase.
Right.
That's a pretty. I think, as a matter of public argument, that's a pretty fine line. To be drawn.
So I think there's a good federalism case. I think I would like to see 50 different health insurance financing regimes in the different states, and let some people try single payer, and let some people try the Cato style approaches, and then we'll see how it all works out. But that's but to say that that the basic approach that you implemented at the state level is odious now that it's being implemented at the federal level, that doesn't make any sense at all.
Doesn't make any sense. Just rounding out this discussion, because despite our disagreement at the bottom line, I find myself largely in agreement with much of what you said, including your statement of the positive. So just my own position about this, accepting the ugly sausage point, is more or less what you said. You've got 30 million plus more people covered. This is better than an unacceptable status quo, a status quo that's unacceptable in a variety of ways. So I think you've done a very good thing by covering a lot of people. You've got a big improvement on the status quo. And also, I think it's better than the ugly, disgusting, noisy, foul process. Produced something that's better than the proposals that were on the table at the beginning of this process. So you've got an improvement over the beginning of the process, an improvement over the status quo, and you've done something that's extremely important. Of course, if none of the ideas in this bill about driving costs down are effective at all, and who knows if they are, but there are lots of ideas in it about driving costs down. If none of those ideas work, then that's not going to be a very good thing.
I would disagree that the bill got better as it went along. I think the cost control measures were weakened. I think the mandate was weakened, which is going to create an adverse selection problem. That is, it will be cheaper to just pay the fine and go naked until you're sick, and then they have to take you because there's no more pre-existing condition denials. So there's a big fat loophole of where people can game the system now. And so that's my fundamental.
I agree with you about that. In that respect, I think it's
my fundamental reason for yes, I think this bill will do some good things, but it's going to cost something like $200 billion a year to do them once the whole thing gets cranked up. And I don't think we're going to get $200 billion worth of annual bang for the buck out of this compared to other ways we could have spent this money, and especially at a time when we're hemorrhaging red ink and when the just enormous, mind-boggling, unfunded liabilities of our previously made commitments to senior citizens under Social Security and Medicare are going to balloon out of sight. I think we are currently in a fiscally unsustainable situation, and we have gone out and bought a shiny new Mercedes or something with bill callers, leaving increasingly frantic messages on our voicemail. So to me, my ultimate feeling about this piece of legislation, and Frum was making the argument that this is Waterloo, that this bill is here, we've lost for good now, and so we really blew it by failing to engage in the process. I really don't believe that this is any kind of final word because I am very skeptical that the cost containment measures in the bill are going to work or are going to be allowed to work. And so what I see is here's it's the great welfare state envisioned by progressives for 75 years now. It's like this family that's been trying to build this house, this dream house, and they've had to cut corners and scale down a little bit. But finally, now after all these decades, they added this final wing to the house, and it's so exciting. And yet, the sad fact is, they built the house right on the San Andreas Fault, and the big one is about to come.
Well, where I'm sitting right now, Brink.
Yes,
I'm looking out my back window, and
it's coming. It is.
Expecting the earth to open up at any moment. Yeah.
And so my sense of things is that probably 10 years from now, not too much longer than that, maybe sooner than that, the unsustainability of our fiscal imbalances are going to precipitate a major crisis. I don't really think the American political process is equipped to deal with the fiscal imbalances until there is a major crisis. I think the way we've been doing business the past decades, knowing about these long-term problems, shows that we aren't. And so God knows what will happen when that occurs, and who knows what will be left of the progressive edifice when the earth shakes. But my feeling is that our current system, conceptualized in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, instituted in the United States beginning in the 1930s and in the 1960s, that this monolithic pay-as-you-go entitlement state isn't going to work for the long term, and we're going to have to redesign it to have things much more on an individually funded or at least pre-funded basis, where real saving is made to pay for the inevitable high costs of old age, and this pay-as-you-go system that we have, and the system of never being able to say no to old people, that's just going to have to change. And because we're going to delay it until the crisis is in full flame, we're going to have much less attractive options than if we could deal with it intelligently now. But that, I'm afraid, is our fate.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty apocalyptic vision, heartfelt, apocalyptic. I don't think it's. I wish I thought it was crazy, but I don't think it is. I'm not. You emphasize being able to say no to old people. I mean, there is a. There appears to be a comparable difficulty saying no to anyone, and I think there's,
Yeah. It's just already, I don't know, it's 35-40% of the federal budget goes to benefits for people 65 or older. It's and it's going to go up. And they're not, 35-40% of the population, and indeed they're considerably better off than people younger than them in terms of net worth, wealth. So it's a crazy, weird redistribution system we've got going here to steal from the young and poor and give to the old and rich. But that's what we do.
My Belgian friend Philippe Van Parijs wrote an article a few years ago defending a proposal that's been kind of was making its way around some of the Greens in parties in Western Europe, which was to basically reduce the voting power of people over 65. I mean, give, for example, extra votes to people who have kids. This is not not exactly a winning idea,
right?
But it was, an effort to address this. Some effort to engage this concern. I don't think it's a concern exclusively among American liberaltarians like you, and which is a suggestion of a segue into another topic. While
I'm being all glum, and let me say I'm not glum at all. I think we're likely to have a fiscal crisis, and it could produce a nasty economic hard landing. I don't have any idea how it will shake out, but ultimately, as Herb Stein's law, if something can't go on forever, it won't, and our current spending trajectory can't go on forever, and it won't. And there could be some serious unpleasantness along the way, but I'm quite sure that the 21st century is going to be better than the 20th, and
that's what I like to hear, Brink.
Overall, things are going to work out. But while I'm being glum, we can talk about the lonely life of the libertarian.
The lonely life of so you and I started having these conversations. I guess it was, a little over 2 years ago that you wrote your piece. I think it was originally in the New Republic on Liberaltarianism.
Yes.
Which was, as I think I may have described it at the time, it was like an effort to find new friends. If I had to summarize it, I would say it was, there you were sitting allied, as a kind of, somewhat, as an independent thinking Republican, if I can put it that way, not liking the political, not enthusiastic about the political alliances that you then had, in part because of concerns about the neoconservative interventionism that the Republican Party had taken on board, particularly with respect to Iraq, partly because of the social conservatism, maybe religiously founded, but whatever, the social conservatism of the Republican Party, but also because as a party of government, the Republicans were by no stretch of the imagination small government conservatives. So you weren't getting fiscal responsibility as a benefit for unhappy foreign policy and social conservatism. It looked like just a really bad package overall. Yep. So I think that's a fair summary. So the question was, what was a reasonable kind of Hayekian classical liberal to do? Is that
And making a pitch to people to the left of center who were groaning under conservative rule that perhaps they could benefit from making some new friends as well. But the timing there was pretty spectacularly off, because the piece came out shortly after the '06 elections, where Dems picked up big wins and won Congress back. Then they went into the '08 cycle, where this historic triumph by Obama and big majorities in both houses. So the piece was aimed at left of center folks, saying that liberalism would do better if it absorbed some key libertarian insights, and indeed, I was making the implicit argument that libertarians belong more with liberals than they do with social conservatives, but the piece was aimed at liberals, and anyway, basically, the kind of amusing aftermath of the article, it's the whole libertarian idea is it's the Generalissimo Francisco Franco of the blogosphere. Do you remember the old Saturday Night Live? I think it was the first season. They just, all their newscasts, they would break in with breaking news that Generalissimo Francisco Franco was still dead, and because I think he died earlier that spring in '75.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I wrote this piece, and the next issue of New Republic, John Chait wrote a piece saying, "To hell with you, libertarians. We don't want anything to do with you," and proclaiming the whole libertarian idea dead. And then people left and right now just keep piping up and proclaiming it dead now for like 3.5 years. So most recently, Ed Kilgore wrote a piece for the New Republic a month or so ago about how Obama has chased libertarians back to the right, and so the whatever potential there was for liberal libertarian romance is now dead once and for all. Anyway, I absolutely, I am completely politically homeless right now.
I'm sorry to hear that. I like you, Brink. You're.
I'm. That's okay though. There's more to life than. But
why? Let's go back to the
partisan enthusiasm. Absolutely, progressives have not taken any of my counsel to heart. They've gone off in another direction, and we'll see how that goes over the long term. Conservatives and Republicans, I think, have just descended even further into kind of the white populist id, and that's what they're about these days. They are dominated by talk show hucksters who are more concerned with market share than with electoral victory or with governance. And that's what they feel like. They feel like shtick. They feel like really dumb shtick. And they're taking a lot of good-hearted people who are naive and gullible and whooping them up into a frenzy and driving them over a cliff. Sooner or later, that's going to play out, because there's no way in the world this approach is ever going to be produce durable majorities in this country. So sooner or later, they're going to get the sense beaten back into them. But it ain't happening right now.
So here's what I'm kind of trying to join these two conversations that we're having here. One about libertarianism and the other about the healthcare bill. Let's go back to this point that David Frum made, which I think we agree has some considerable force to it, which is that the bill that was eventually proposed was an ugly, bloody sausage version of Heritage Foundation 1993 ideas. So it's
let me just interject at that point that Cato hated the Heritage Plan back in '93 and proclaimed it apostasy, and so we're not down. The fact that it has conservative and Republican DNA doesn't doesn't cut much ice with us.
Well, I didn't think it cut much. I thought maybe it cut a little bit of ice.
Yeah,
I mean,
not much.
you know, the point is, it doesn't have. You know, it's not a single payer system.
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
This
doesn't
is
have a public
a,
option.
Right.
It's got subsidies as a way to get. I mean, it has some of the features. I guess what I'm thinking, you know, is something like this. You know, without in any way effacing the distinction between the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute, and without trying to turn the Cato Institute into the Stato Institute.
Right.
If I were, you know, a liberaltarian, and you know, I think there's something. I find Hayek's views pretty interesting, even though I disagree with them. If I were a liberaltarian, what I would think is this was a lost opportunity. That is, you had a proposal which was basically a kind of, you know, insurance market, or regulate the insurance market, add in a bunch of subsidies for purposes of equity, and it could have been more like that. And the reason that it wasn't more like that was not because the progressives in the Democratic Party were winning victory after victory, because they were losing, you know, right, over and over again. The reason it wasn't more like that was because people on the Republican side were just not prepared to play at all. So if I were a libertarian, I wouldn't, I'd think that this was actually, to some extent, a lost opportunity to do something that would have looked a little bit more congruent with your convictions, and that as I say, the reason that it was lost was not because the Democrats won a big electoral victory, and not because the progressives were dominating in the Democratic Party, but because the people who could have moved it in that direction just had absolutely no taste for doing so.
That's a fair point. I don't think healthcare reform was. It's probably the worst possible starting point for some kind of libertarian project.
Yeah, right.
Because.
Yeah.
Because I think the current system stinks, and we really need radical overhaul. What we had here is incremental conservative, small c conservative, building on the existing structures, but I think the existing structures are a mess. So, and then, but by the same token, this idea of universal health care has just been, the progressive white whale for decades and decades, and it's just too late to talk you all out of it. So anyway, now it's happened, and maybe now we'll see how this thing actually works, and whether some of the benefits that are being touted actually pan out, and whether some of the cost constraints that are being touted actually pan out. And if they don't, if my skeptical take on how this is really going to flesh out turns out to be true, then maybe we can start talking about better ways to produce the commonly desired result of universal access to some decent minimum of health care.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're skeptical.
But where we were, I just think that. So my optimistic side is now that you've harpooned Moby Dick and maybe the result's going to be the same. Maybe come November, the Dems are going to be pulled down into the whirlpool with it. But maybe not. We'll see. But anyway, over the longer term, now that the question of universal access has been answered politically, maybe we can start looking for ways to do this better
to make it a workable thing. I think my expectation is that in 5 years, maybe in 5 minutes given the news cycle, but certainly in 5 years, you will regard your pessimistic expectations as about how this was going to work out as having been vindicated. Others, say me, will regard my, I wouldn't say optimistic, but hopeful expectations as having been vindicated. And at the same time, we'll agree that things really need some serious repairs because you think this is going to, maybe it'll produce some good, but it's going to do some damage, and the damage is going to need to be corrected. And I think it's going to do some damage, but it's done a lot of good, and the damage, of course, needs to be corrected, and it'll be, I think it's going to be a matter of, it'll be like Social Security. There's going to be.
I think that libertarian ideas about the creative power of decentralized experimentation of markets and competition, and about the limits of top-down government solutions to social problems. I think those ideas are important and have great weight, and they belong in the larger liberal vision of creating a society of where an inclusive vision of all people, all individuals flourishing according to their own lights and in lives of their own choosing. This idea of sort of inclusiveness, that is, that society's rules ought to work for everybody, but by everybody's own lights, an individualistic view of sort of successful exercise of autonomy. That liberal vision is one that libertarians and progressives share. They differ about how best to institutionalize getting there.
That's right.
I think I'm right in ways that progressives are wrong about how the world works and about the best institutions for producing that world. And my expectation is that over time, the current kind of entitlement system is going to be shown to be unworkable, and that we're going to have to rethink how to do these things. In the meantime, I have just given up on the American right as a vessel for these kinds of libertarian ideas. I think so. Maybe this project of trying to convince the left to change its mind about some economics questions is doomed. But I think it's still the best plan people like me have.
I entirely agree with you about that. I think there's a lot of maybe a little bit less enthusiasm for one-size-fits-all top-down solutions among some of us on the left than your general remarks suggest. I certainly identify myself with a lot of what you just said. Speaking of more inclusive visions, and mindful that we're running pretty short on time, I thought we might just take a minute to talk about what could easily be the next big topic on the table, likely to make the divisiveness of this one pale by comparison, unfortunately, which is the issue of immigration. Reform. Yeah, what's your...
Well, and here's an area where on policy questions, liberals and libertarians have more common ground than libertarians and conservatives. I think liberals and progressives are divided about this issue, but there's at least anyway. I think there does seem to be movement. Of course, Obama promised to work on immigration reform. He actually promised to do something on it in his first year, and that's come and gone. And the Hispanic community is restive about that promise unkept. And so there was a big rally here in D.C. over the weekend in favor of immigration reform last week. Knowing this was coming, Obama had a day of White House meetings where, among other, he met with various groups, but he also met with Chuck Schumer and Lindsey Graham, who are co-sponsors of what looks like the leading legislative vehicle for comprehensive immigration reform. So there's... I remain kind of skeptical that there's just agenda space for anything big happening this year. But it looks like at least some muscles are being flexed, and there's at least some throat clearing to try to try to get some movement on comprehensive immigration reform. And in broad outline, I think this is a great idea. And is actually an area of real kind of libertarian potential. But boy, is it political dynamite.
It is political. I mean, Lindsey Graham, the Graham-Schumer proposal has not been greeted with large amounts of enthusiasm among others in the Republican Party. There were also there's also been some unenthusiastic reception among some Democrats and progressives. As I understand it, the Graham-Schumer proposal has, it's really a kind of this is the sort of bullet point version of what's not
right.
really a fully fleshed out piece of legislation yet, but you've got a kind of biometric Social Security, ID system.
Right.
You do a bunch of stuff to tighten borders. You have a temporary worker program that enables you to control some flow in and out, and then you have a path to legalization that requires some mix of an acknowledgement that you did something wrong by coming across the border, a requirement of, I think there's an English language test, and then there's a requirement of community service among people who are in the country illegally,
right.
And that's the path to legalization. So this is not a very promising proposal for anybody who thinks that if you came across illegally, you got to go.
Right.
And
no,
since
but that's I think that idea is just wacky and is never going to be implemented.
Right.
So
right.
I mean, what we have here is just what happens when laws try to muck around with supply and demand. You get black markets. We've got a huge supply of willing workers south of the border who could raise their income manyfold by coming here. We've got a huge demand in the United States for this kind of cheap labor. Our economic system is open enough where we can make use of it. Our labor markets are flexible enough where those kind of people can get jobs, as opposed to Europe, where it's tougher for low-skilled workers to find work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then we've got this immigration system that does not have a channel for legal immigration based on coming here as a low-skilled worker. And so we get this whopping huge black market of humans. And right now we got 11 or 12 million of them here living basically as outlaws in just a horrible, wretched, shameful situation. And I think those people who have been here and have been working in this country to make it a better place, they deserve to be able to stay. And I think if making them jump through some hoops and get in line on a path towards citizenship is understandable and appropriate. And but it's just intolerable to have such a huge number of people here just living in the legal shadows that must be addressed.
And living in illegal shadows, but also essentially living as a subordinate caste.
Yes, right, exactly, because you have no legal status.
Right.
And then we need to ensure that this doesn't happen again, that 10, 20 years from now we don't have a new crop of millions of people living illegally. And the only way to do that is to create some kind of guest worker program, some kind of, and people hate the sound of that, just create temporary visas for people to come here and work. And
I think the issue about temporary visas, I think there's a very, let me first on the point about people, being here and getting their status legalized. We did an article in Boston Review sometime over the past year by a very thoughtful Canadian political theorist, Joe Cairns, and it's about if you've been here for a while, you have a right to stay because you're really a member in everything but official imprimatur. And in the article, he tells the story of a woman in Scotland named Marguerite Rimmond, I think was her name, who was about 80 years old, and she'd come to Scotland as a child and had never left the country. But she knew that she was in the country illegally all of that time. She knew she was in the country illegally because the first time she ever traveled outside the country at age 80, she went to Australia and she got an American passport. So, she'd been in Scotland for 75 years.
Yes.
And when she came back into the country, there was trouble created for her, and they told her she had to leave the country within a month. Mm-hmm. And eventually the decision was rescinded. But this was a case of somebody who'd come in illegally. I didn't forget, because she traveled on an American passport, so she knew she'd been illegally. And I think every sensible observer of this thinks this is absurd to tell somebody who was brought in, she didn't choose to come in, she came in as a kid, and she'd spent her entire life in the place, in Scotland, that, she was a member of the country and shouldn't have been excluded from it. And, I think when you start walking back from that and you think, well, suppose she had only been in the country 65 years instead of 75 years or 45 years or 50, and we can start getting into, delicate areas, when we get down in the neighborhood of 3 years or something like that. But the idea that you've been around for, and you're, that you don't get some kind of path to stay.
There's an analogous principle in property law called adverse possession. If you squat on a piece of land and work it for 21 years and nobody kicks you off, it's yours. And so if you come here and work and nobody kicks you out for a certain period of time, then I think your moral claim on being able to stay is strong.
Yeah, I agree. The thing that I think is important you said two things. One is that there is this issue about supply and demand. You got a bunch of people who can improve their wages tenfold by coming across the border, and you got a bunch of people on the other side of the border who are prepared to hire them. And the idea that you're going to prevent people from coming across, given that given that level of improvement and the existence on the demands, just doesn't make any sense. The issue is, I think, whether there's the policy issue here is whether a temporary worker's proposal, in and of itself, is going to be sufficient to deal with that issue, as opposed to having some kind of temporary visa, as the WTO I think calls it, temporary movement of natural persons. Issue. Is that going to be sufficient? Or, I think probably, and this is where maybe there's a basis for, libertarian cooperation, common discussion, is that you're probably going to have to do something about immigration quotas as well. Basically, you have very stringent quotas against people coming here from precisely the places where, most people want to come from. That means Mexico in particular. So I think I think the basic diagnosis that you give is absolutely right. That you've got a bunch of people who are going to come across because they really want to be here, and it's not a bad place. I like being here. You like being here. I can understand why other people.
Yes. So no, I would go for more. Right. I would like more liberal, higher immigration. Legal immigration totals for not just for temporary work-related visas, but the bare minimum you have to have is to allow people to come here and work for a period of time. And the fact is, a lot of it's a forgotten story of the Great Immigration in the late 19th, early 20th century. How many people came here and went back?
Yes, about a third went back. About a third went back to Italy. Right.
That's right. And there was a big circular flow before 1986, before the Simpson-Mazzoli immigration bill that really started cracking down on border security.
Yeah.
There was people would come up here, work seasonally, earn a little bundle, and go back home. And what happened after '86 there was really no drop off in illegal entry. But what happened was people stopped going back.
Yeah.
So the exit numbers started going down because they couldn't risk being unable to get back across the border again, or because it was such a hassle that they didn't want to do that again. And so, it's yet another case of a perverse outcome. But the law accomplished precisely the opposite of what it intended to accomplish. It actually deterred people going back. So I think that if we did have a credible legal channel for temporary work, and it were big enough that it was basically about as big as the current illegal flow, then we could get rid of the black market. I would like to encourage broader immigration and with a path to citizenship as well. But to get rid of the black market, I think a big temporary visa channel would work. And here, the two sides of the bill cause heartburn for both sides of the ideological spectrum. The left, especially organized labor, have a real problem with the temporary worker program.
Yeah.
And the right has a terrible problem with anything that smacks of amnesty and providing a path to citizenship for anybody who came here illegally.
Yeah.
And with the Dems going forward, I worry about their gutting or so watering down a temporary worker provision to please organized labor that it's really not worth anything, and so that we just have the black market still. And last go around in the Bush administration's failed efforts at comprehensive immigration reform, there were a series of killer amendments to water down the temporary worker program, and Senator Obama voted for them.
Yeah.
So maybe he'll be different now that he's in office, but I worry that only the Dems, I think, can get this done. The Republicans have no appetite for it now after Bush's failure. Any pro-immigration Republicans, there are some, but they have no appetite for taking on their base again. So
John McCain is
a Democrat has to do it, but I worry that fidelity to the interests of organized labor is going to produce a reform that doesn't really reform where it's needed.
Well, this brings us back to the central issue, which is the abysmal shape of the political discussion and of the political process. And I would just reiterate what I was saying to 2 points. One is that I do think that this is a very promising area for collaboration between different people who believe in inclusive society, who have maybe different, who don't want to live in put it polemically, who don't want to live in a cruel and caste society, and they have different visions about how exactly to do that. And just to be clear, I very much include you in that group of people, and different visions about how to do that. And then there's a possibility of trying to craft something workable here, but you're worried about the store being given away to organized labor, and there may be something to that. I think organized labor was pretty unhappy with how things worked out on the healthcare thing, although they're sort of happy with the result. And I think the issue about whether or not the difficulty with getting something that makes sense here is partly that there isn't going to be any cooperation at all from the Republicans, and so what you're going to, I think we're agreeing with that, and so what you're going to end up doing is having yet another fight between progressive Democrats and whoever the Liebermans and Ben Nelsons are, the equivalent of that on the immigration issue, and that's And then people can complain about the deficiencies of one-party rule, but the people who bear some substantial responsibility for turning this into a situation of one-party rule are the people who keep on thinking, that the Rush Limbaughs of the world who are holding the feet of the Republican Party to the fire by saying, on day one, I want this guy to lose, I want him to fail. And then the Jim DeMints who are saying, it wasn't okay, that wasn't Waterloo. The next time it'll be Waterloo.
Right. One interesting thing that will come to light if an immigration political battle does heat up is how the Tea Party movement reacts to it. A lot of, particularly interesting for libertarians like me who think that the right as it's currently constituted is just unsalvageable, and who are distressed at fellow libertarians who are thinking that some sort of libertarian right is in the offing with the Tea Party movement.
Yeah.
Thus far, the Tea Party movement has looked pretty libertarian. It's not talking about social issues. It's just talking about big government and too much spending. And of course, those concerns have my full sympathy. I'm skeptical of anything arising on the right being capable of doing anything constructive once it gets into power. As a blocking coalition, I've been happy to see this kind of anti-big government phenomenon on the right, but I just don't expect anything out of it as a potential governing philosophy.
Well,
but anyway, if immigration heats up, it'll be interesting to see just how libertarian the Tea Partiers are, because my sense is that a lot of them are in the sort of most virulently anti-immigrant camp.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm inclined to agree that there is a very strong small government conservative element of the Tea Party movement, which was disgusted by the kind of, big government non-conservatism, as they see it, big government non-conservatism of the Bush administration and, plague on all your houses type of thing. And so there's some element of that, and then a very strong element of, however you referred to it before, kind of white populist strand. And my guess, and I think yours as well, is the unhappy one that when push comes to shove on the immigration issue, that the white populist strand is going to dominate the small government conservative, more open, inclusive society that's not a caste society strand of the Tea Party movement. But on that happy note or unhappy note, I forget which it is. We should
wind it up.
But
great talking to you, and I look forward to chatting again. We'll see how some of this stuff shakes out.
Nice to talk.
All right. Take care, Josh. Bye.